Hello my dear friends, how is it going? I'm Ari Theriger and here I am to give a continuation to the case of human sacrifices in Old Norse society. This time focusing on sacrifices of human children, if children were indeed sacrificed or not. Well, I think it is interesting to see that many societies, both past and present, often speak of the sacrifice of children when they want to convey derogatory message in relation to another society and the atrocities they do. In some cases, so far, there are no substantial evidences, but in others, there's plenty of horrifying examples. Recently, it was pointed out to me another of Thor's movie, Thor, Love and Thunder, 2022. So I've recently watched it. I'm not exactly sure what I've watched in there. I've seen the previous movies, and this one is certainly quite different. Perhaps its brilliancy is so avant-garde that I'm not able to truly grasp the deep message and the inspirational cleverness of its directors. Who knows? Be that as it may, this film contains a controversial scene. At least I think it may be controversial, although it may have passed as a joke and perhaps not a lot of people may have been bothered by this. I don't know. You tell me. Thor comments that they, or them, referring to the Asgardians, no longer make child sacrifices, more or less. In fact, to be more precise, it's darker than that, I think, as the children are kidnapped and Thor says something between the lines of going to save the children and then there will be a great feast, they will feast. And he immediately makes the point of specifying that we shall feast, but not children. We don't do that anymore, pointing out to a very dark past to which the other Asgardians express shame, like they used to eat children. This was just a short phrase or a moment that made me think, because it raises a question regarding the pre-Christian Norse beliefs, whether, after all, the Old Norse performed child sacrifices. Now, eating children, that would be a whole other thing, which, honestly, as gruesome and horrible as it sounds, obviously, I would not be surprised, given that past civilizations did pretty weird, brutal, macabre, and horrific things for today's standards, of course. Looking at Old Norse deities, and many other deities for that matter, which were part of the religiosity of many past societies, the stories, the myths, the social and moral values are not acceptable by today's standards. And that's also kind of the point I would like to make here, if you wouldn't mind. You see, also quite recently, I came about a few discussions on pagan groups of people proudly saying they have pagan morals and values. And sometimes I like to be that person that kind of ruins things a little bit with some reality check, you know, putting a little bit of chaos in it, shake things up and see what happens. I asked people what did they mean by pagan morals and values, to which pagan culture or cultures they were referring to, because, well, there were many pagan cultures and each one had very different perspectives on life and very different morals and values. Some people said it was more about the love and respect for nature, which I totally understand, obviously. But you know, the Romans were pagans and they vastly destroyed landscapes and fauna and flora. Not only were the Romans responsible for the extinction of many animal species, but looking at the stratigraphic analysis of ice from the North Pole, we can distinctly see the ages of human history in which the air was more polluted, caused by human activity, and before industrialization, the Romans were the civilization that burnt more wood than anybody else, and thus made more air pollution. They were pagan, but they had little regard for nature and its creatures. But of course, the great majority of people were talking about Viking morals and values, so the values and morals of pirates and warriors. They surely mean Old Norse and or pre-Christian Scandinavian Iron Age and early Middle Ages societies, but Anyway, I like to make the point that although many past societies surely had good morals on certain aspects, some of which we have indeed carried into our modern society, still they had plenty of different views on what was good and right and just, and what was morally acceptable or not. And as pagans, we should definitely be a little bit more specific when we say we have pagan morals and values, because a lot of such morals and values are really no longer acceptable, and thank the gods, because we have evolved. Let's take the example of Old Norse society in terms of justice and punishment for one's crimes. As you know, capital punishment was very rare within Old Norse society, something that prevails today in many countries, but sadly not all. It actually demonstrates a well-structured sense of justice when you do not commit the same crime for which the person you judge is being convicted of. It was rare to sentence to death a person who has committed a crime, including having committed a murder. I mean, where's the justice in taking a life as judgment for a murder? Doesn't bring the victim back to life. It's simply an act of vengeance, not justice. Makes no sense, actually, because if life is so precious and highly valued, and it is a crime to take a life, why is it right for the organization that deals out justice to take a life as a punishment for the act of taking a life? Why is it wrong for the general public to take a life, but not for the class that makes the laws and deals out justice? Viking Age society gave good examples of conduct through the way they gave judgment. Not taking a life as punishment for taking a life. I know some people of certain countries would disagree and say that capital punishment is necessary, but a lot of reasonable people from several other countries would disagree and present pretty good arguments. The point here is that to Old Norse people, the life of a person had great value, so capital punishment was rare. However, this has the other side of the coin. Indeed, human life had great value for Old Norse people, which is why they sacrificed humans. See here the discrepancy in moral values and perceptions on life. Socially and in terms of justice and fairness, it was wrong to take a life, but not in religious cases. In those terms, it was right to sacrifice a human person. It was morally justifiable to kill a human being. Thus, this side of the coin on pagan morals and values is also included when modern pagans proudly state they have pagan morals and values, or pagan moral values. You've got to be a little bit more specific. People romanticize too much past cultures, and that's a problem. Not only that, but often people point out how other non-European pre-Christian cultures were so awful by doing this and that, when our ancestors were doing the exact same things, or worse, far worse. We cannot change what was done, obviously, but we can certainly improve everyday life to make a better present and future. Not everything that was once pagan was good and right and beautiful and just. If we don't want to be bothered by digging deep into the mentalities of past societies, that's totally understandable, well, we just have to look at their gods and see the very clear sense of imperfection, yet a sense of the imperfect was precisely the driving force that made these past societies want to better themselves and improve. I should say that so much talk of how good it is to have pagan morals and values, but the fact is that the act of human sacrifice in our modern society is not acceptable, and despite all the flaws and horrible atrocities and injustice, it was actually Christianity that progressively put an end to human sacrifices. So that aspect is actually goes to the little bag of Christian moral values. So, as was stated before on the previous video in relation to these themes, indeed Norse society performed human sacrifices, and it was especially gruesome. For some years, it was thought that references to human sacrifices has been just Christian propaganda to denigrate the pagan societies they came in contact with. Take the example of the horrifying accounts of human sacrifices when in the Viking period, both by the German bishop Hitemar of Merseburg, who has described how Nordic people met every 9 years at Lejre on Zealand in Denmark in January to offer to their gods 99 people and just as many animals. Seems pretty exaggerated, but probably wasn't. And the German monk Adam of Bremen, who in the second half of the 11th century wrote about the sacrificial tradition or at Gamma Uppsala in Sweden, where the temple was devoted to Thor, Odin, and Freyr. And here the Old Norse also met every 9 years to ensure the goodwill of the gods, and for that purpose 9 males of all kinds of living creatures, including humans, were sacrificed in a holy grove nearby, near the temple. The number 9 always present, and it was indeed a magical number in pre-Christian Scandinavian belief systems. So, it seems pretty exaggerated, weird, strange, abnormal, not at all in accordance to the laws in Scandinavia at the time, etc., etc. And indeed, admittedly, there's been an extensive debate over whether these accounts were real or simply Christian propaganda or fabrication, as both the aforementioned Christian chroniclers did not actually witness the cult activities themselves. They wrote their chronicles in a time period that coincides with the Scandinavian late Iron Age, the Viking Age, and the early Middle Ages, when Christianity had taken over and human sacrifices were no longer acceptable. Nevertheless, I would recommend caution when researching written sources, or especially these written sources, due to their pejorative, moralistic, or fanciful nature. But not all of it is pure fabrication, mind you. These accounts have been dismissed as pure fabrication as a matter of fact, concerning certain aspects of them, of course, especially the case of human sacrifices. There's plenty of archaeological finds from recent years which show that human sacrifice was a reality in several pre-Christian periods of Nordic history. But what about children? Well then, references to ancient sacrifices among Norse people are nothing new for anyone who knows a little bit about the Viking Age. Descriptions about sacrifices abound in Icelandic sagas, historical chronicles in Latin and Arabic, iconography and archaeology. And from the archaeological data, what can be deduced so far is that the deaths, the human and animal sacrifice, were produced or conducted to obtain some type of supernatural advantage, apotropaic motivation, or votive offerings to the gods. Most of the skeletons, the human osteological remains, recovered indicate that they were enslaved people killed to accompany their masters during the journey to the afterlife. But what about the children? Is there any material evidence of infanticide in the Viking Age? The answer is yes. And the evidence is recent. In the fortress of Trelleborg in Zealand Island in Denmark, intriguing remains from the time of religious change were discovered. At the site, several wells were excavated containing the remains of animals: a goat, a dog, a horse, and a cow, and 4 children dated between the 8th and the 10th centuries who were possibly ritually killed, perhaps to obtain apotropaic or fertility elements. Strontium isotope analysis of the children's remains determined that they were of local origin. The Trelleborg sacrificial site is a recent evidence of the sacrifice of children from the period before the Viking fortress was erected in 980-981. In 5 of the deep wells, human and animal skeletons were found, together with jewelry and tools. Of the total of 5 human sacrifices, 4 were young children aged between 4 and 7. Perhaps I should point out that the pre-Christian Nordic belief systems attributed great symbolic importance to wells, right? At least we know it from later literary sources. For instance, the case of Odin gaining wisdom from drinking at Mimir's well. In exchange, he had to sacrifice one of his eyes to Mimir. Even though several themes in Old Norse myths may not be quite clear to us nowadays, they do present several ritualistic performances, and it's interesting, I think, that Odin sacrificed part of himself to the well the same way people sacrificed human beings to well, sacrificing important things, clearly to receive something in return. The sacrifices themselves could have been towards the god Odin, but that isn't clear due to the lack of other evidences that could readily point to it. Although I should perhaps say that the well of Mimir bears close similarities to the Celtic cauldron of plenty, which later on influenced the stories of the Holy Grail. But that is perhaps something for another video, for another time. But well, when the fortress of Trelleborg was constructed, the cult site was dismantled and the sacrifices stopped. In the new Christian religion, which was progressively becoming even more permanent and adopted, humans were not sacrificed anymore, no longer sacrificed. So these sacrifices of children show us that it was very much a pagan intention. And if you have the time, of course, I suggest you watch a very interesting documentary. I'll show you an image here for this particular case, precisely a reenactment of child sacrifice at Trelleborg fortress in Denmark in an animation produced for the DR documentary produced in 2023, Gåden om Odin, the riddle or the enigma of Odin, as best as I can translate to make some sense. It's actually the second episode, Harald's Guda, the gods of Harald, and I assure you it's better than Thor's movie Love and Thunder. But well, several analyses have also determined that the site of the Trelleborg fortress was an important ceremonial site, well before the construction of the fortress itself, this during the end of the 10th century, of course. In the area of the north gate of the fortress, there was a building with staves associated with the wells, possibly a ritual building serving people who had not yet converted to the new faith, the new religion. So these archaeological findings may shed a new light on several aspects of human sacrifice in pre-Christian Scandinavian societies, in particular child sacrifice in the Iron Age. And this makes me actually think about the Storhamar stone, which depicts a scene which is interpreted as a lot, a sacrifice to Odin. In the middle, we see a person which apparently is being sacrificed on an altar. There are several iconographic details here that points to a sacrifice to the cult of Odin, or in the cult of Odin. And perhaps this figure being sacrificed due to its small size may have been a child, or Old Norse people really hated small persons, or most likely due to the limitations on the surface in which this scene was depicted. To fit it all in, the individual being sacrificed is just small due to the limited space to carve this scene on. Still, child sacrifice was also a thing, at least in Viking Age Denmark. Now, I'm sorry, I admit this is the first time I do this in relation to the title of this video, Child Sacrifice in the Cult of Thor. It's more of a reference to Thor's movie here spoken before and what he said, but also to get your attention, sort of clickbait, sorry. It's actually the first time I do this in 7 years of YouTube, of doing videos for YouTube, and I really don't like the sensation. Cut me some slack, will you? Hopefully this video was useful and gave you something to think about. But in relation to Thor, well, There are no evidences to which deity specifically these children have been sacrificed to. However, we know from written sources that Odin demanded human sacrifices, for instance, as an example of a deity. We also know that the temple at Old Uppsala was dedicated to Odin, Thor, and Freyr, and there were human sacrifices to these deities. So Thor isn't totally out of the picture in relation to child sacrifice. As said before, even though Mimir's well is connected to Odin's sacrifice for wisdom, it is, nonetheless, a representation of the sacrificial wells. Besides, the well of Mimir does have parallels with the Celtic cauldron of plenty and the association of the sacrifice and the cult of severed heads towards fertility, plenty, and other beneficial aspects. Many victims were sacrificed to the gods, especially in times of strife and of great famine. We know from written sources human sacrifices were also to obtain apotropaic or fertility elements. Thor was indeed a deity related to fertility, a farmer's god, if you will. So it is not totally out of the picture the sacrifice of children to the cult or in the cult of Thor in desperate times of great need in terms of food production. And don't think this was an isolated case. There's plenty to discover still out there, and there are many past horrors still buried in the earth. And it's also quite possible that human babies were sacrificed as well. As said here before on other videos, as an archaeologist myself, babies are often absent from the archaeological context, yet the infant deaths were quite common and numerous up until the 19th century, so quite recently. It's just that babies' bones are in the early process of formation and are often quite soft and not yet hardened enough to the point of enduring time, so they often disappear. Only in very specific contexts, for instance, in environments with lack of oxygen, a lot more easily perishable materials can be preserved. Absence of evidence doesn't always mean evidence of absence. Anyway, my dear friends, I do hope indeed this video was useful. I hope you have enjoyed it. Thank you so much for watching. See you on the next video. And as always, tack för idag. Thanks for today. Obrigado por hoje. Until we meet again, my dear friends.